Pozdravujem vás, teším sa, že sme sa tu dnes mohli stretnúť, takže za chvíľočku začíname prednášku s tým, že vás poprosím, aby ste si vypli svoje mobilné telefóny, aby nám to tu príliš nezvonilo. Tí, čo by ste potrebovali preklad, máte staničky, čiže tie si môžete zapnúť, je tam normálne taký ten klasický gombík na zapínanie, vypínanie. Bude to vlastne celé prebiehať v angličtine a dostali ste aj notesy, kto by chcel vlastne položiť nejakú otázku. Otázky budete buď môcť napísať v slovenčine alebo v angličtine a bude k dispozícii potom aj mikrofón, že kto by sa chcel niečo spýtať aj osobne, že nie písať na papier, tak bude tu aj mikrofón potom kolovať. Takže začneme teraz s touto prednáškou.
Dobrý deň prajem. Ja som Beata Balogová, šéfredaktorka týždenníka The Slovak Spectator. Dear ladies and gentlemen, Abigail Goldman believes that good journalism sometimes make people to cancel their newspaper subscriptions and that journalists should be very careful about the compromises they are making, not to make people angry or to stop canceling their newspaper subscriptions if they don't like what the journalists write. She also believes that essentials of the journalism don't change with the changing technology and that those really essentials remain, which are commitment to truth, fairness, and accuracy. She also believes that reporters are not just like tape recorders, human tape recorders, and that they should question what the authority says and not just to write down anything they hear. And while there will be many readers who will be, desiring the celebrity gossip, we believe, and Abigail Goldman believes, that there will be always a substantial group of readers who will expect the journalists to do their job, which really means reporting about issues that are substantial for the society and looking into how societies are actually treating their citizens. Journalism for Abigail Goldman is not just the detour to see her byline in the newspaper, but she has been a journalist for many, many years, and the reward for her work came in the form of sharing the Pulitzer Prize in 2004 for the series of The Walmart Effect, which analyzed the tactics of Walmart, including prices and wage policy, and how Walmart shapes economies of entire countries. Goldman is a graduate of the Columbia University's School of Journalism, and she worked for the Los Angeles Times for 16 years. Currently, she is a journalism instructor at the University of California, Los Angeles. And today, she's here in Košice, and she's eager and excited to talk to you. Please welcome Abigail Goldman.
Dobrý deň. Ďakujem za pozvanie. Dobre. To je všetko, čo viem v slovančine. Thank you. Students, ladies and gentlemen, first, I would like to thank Pettit Academy, the Slovak Spectator, the Tatra Banka Foundation, Comenius University, and Košice 2013 for bringing me here and hosting me today. When I was developing this talk, I looked at all the ideas I wanted to discuss with you and decided it was perfect for a university campus. When I was in college, we used to parody our professor's love of the crazy analogy. I don't know if students here are asked this sort of question, but in the US, no student of the humanities can escape a final exam question such as, analyze the economics of the new agrarianism, Slobodan Milosevic, folklore of the Middle Ages, and rutabagas. Okay, that one wasn't serious, but you get the idea. My talk today will bring you through a series of ideas that may seem as disparate. My goal is to show you how pencil-lead, Uri Janošík, the Haitian practice of voodoo, the world's biggest company, and industrializing China all relate to the subject of truth. You can let me know at the end what grade you would give my effort. Before I go on, how many people here understand English? Oh, okay, good. All right. So I expect all of you to laugh very hard right when I say something funny, or even if it's a little funny, because the rest of people will be catching up with the simultaneous translation. So I'm counting on all of you. Since we're on a college campus, I want to take you to my university. My university is an enormous campus in Middle America at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, the state capital. It has a student body of about 44,000 undergraduate and graduate students. I learned how to be a journalist there. I loved my graduate education at Columbia, but I would not have been able to make the most of it without the lessons I learned in tiny Madison, Wisconsin. The students had 2 independent student daily newspapers, which competed viciously, so I'm obliged to say that I worked for the better one. It was called the Daily Cardinal, and it was an amazing training ground. Now, when I look back, I laugh that we took ourselves very seriously. We would argue into the wee hours of the night about how we denizens of democracy in Madison, Wisconsin, should cover rebel groups in Nicaragua, or what our editorial page should say on the issue, as if the government there, or in the US for that matter, would say, wait a minute, the 20-year-olds in Madison, Wisconsin have a different idea for us. That's not quite how it was. And yet, somehow, student journalism still mattered, although not probably in the way we thought it might. We thought we were educating our fellow students, and I would like to hope that we did. But we also educated ourselves in the art and craft of being reporters. A year ago, it was my newspaper's 120th anniversary. Now, in a European context, that doesn't sound very old. In an American context, that's pretty old. So they invited back all the alumni, and they had enough alumni who were award winners that they had 2 separate panels of speakers, one of all the living Pulitzer winners, because we had a number of Pulitzer winners who had worked at our paper who had died, and all of the living Emmy winners for broadcast journalism. And among the things we talked about, all of us who were there on these panels and with our audience, was what made our newspaper or our university or our experience different. How could this little paper in Madison, Wisconsin, produce these eminent journalists, far more eminent than I, believe me? There was one of the men sitting next to me, I believe, had won 3 Pulitzers. And we had a lot of different answers. Now, the Daily Cardinal, like most student papers, was always strapped for money, and therefore newsprint, and therefore space. So we never had enough room to write the stories we wanted to write, or to write as much about the stories that we wanted to write. And we prided ourselves on changing the famous New York Times slogan. The New York Times says, all the news that's fit to print. At the Daily Cardinal, we used to say, all the news that fits. A little bit different. But the Cardinal, small though it was, had a long association as a progressive paper. Now, whatever that may mean to different people, what it meant to us was finding truth in suspicion of power and speaking for the voiceless. It served me very well in my career, as did my classes in history, political science, literature. Classes taught me how to think. The Daily Cardinal taught me to question. No answers have ever been discovered without asking questions. It is our primary task as journalists. I have my first aside, you'll see I have many. My first aside from being in Madison, Wisconsin, when you're at a university that big, there are a couple times every so often when it makes national news. Whenever there's a presidential election, for instance, the candidates, particularly in the US, the Democratic candidates courting a student vote, will come to the University of Wisconsin, primarily because it's so big. There are a lot of students there, and they will come and listen. So every winter, during the presidential campaign, we would get a visit from one or another of the presidential candidates. And it was a lot of fun for the student journalist. First, because we got to write about the presidential candidates, which was and is a very big deal, but also because along with the presidential candidates comes the National Press Corps. These are reporters who work for all the major papers, the major radio stations, broadcast institutions, and they all fly around with the candidates and go where the candidates go and write about whatever they do. Well, most of those professional journalists didn't have a lot of time for the student journalists, and this is where we got our revenge. Let me explain something. I know you think that it gets cold in Slovakia. Well, I looked up the weather, and it seems like the coldest it gets outside of the mountains is something like -5 Celsius. That about right? That seems a little colder? A little colder, but not much. Okay. That would be balmy for somebody from Wisconsin. They would break out shorts for -5. Because in Wisconsin, it often gets to something like -23 or more. So it's -28 was, I think, what I looked up when I did the conversion. So it's very cold. Invariably, the candidates would come in the winter. And there were a few things that would happen every time. The first is the National Press Corps would go flying in, telling jokes from their airplane, trampling all over the poor student reporters who were all there to cover for the student papers. And then here comes the revenge part. From there, while the candidate was waiting to talk, or they were waiting to write, they'd be stamping their feet because they were freezing. We, of course, were dressed for the weather. Then the really fun part happened. The candidate would start to speak, and all these professional, very important, very famous reporters would take out their pens, and it was always the same thing. They'd start writing, they'd get sort of a quizzical look on their face, shake the pen, they'd try to write again. Now they scribble, trying to make their pen. You could see what's happening, and all of them are doing it. Shaking, shaking, scribble, my pen's not working, looks over, their pen's not working. Ballpoint pens don't work in the cold. No student journalist in Wisconsin would ever be caught without several pencils. In fact, I kept a mini pencil sharpener in my pocket. Now, if anyone in the National Press Corps had been nice to us, I would have offered them one, because all of us had several. But they tended not to be nice, and so we'd giggle and point and laugh, and they were getting more and more panicked because the candidate's talking and they've got no way to write it down. Meanwhile, all of us at the student paper are happily taking notes with our pencils and laughing and laughing. So I think there are a couple points here. The first is probably that the moral is we should always have more than one kind of writing utensil. And be nice to the young'uns. That's first for the professionals. More to the point, I think it's a nice analogy. I'm back to that, aren't I, again, the analogies. For searching for the truth, because it requires us to put arrogance and ego aside, if for no other reason than that the people we meet in pursuit of our quest for the truth often know things that we don't. It's a lesson I try not to forget. I also thought more about my college days when I began to learn a little bit about Slovakia. My school brethren would have loved the story of Juraj Jánosik. How'd I do on saying that name, by the way? I do okay? We all know who I'm talking about? Okay. Many of you probably know we have a similar tale that comes to us from England, the tale of Robin Hood. He's the hero of the downtrodden who lived in the forest and fought oppression by robbing from the rich to give to the poor. Leave aside what you may believe to be true or not true about Juraj Jánosik and just focus on the myth or the stories that I read when I was learning about him. Jánosik would have been appealing to the kind of journalists my college friends and I wanted to be, for a simple reason. The first story I read about Jánosik, Jánosik's Fest, told of the time Jánosik encountered a tyrannical baron who had shown no mercy to the common people. "You are the reason I do what I do," Jánosik told the baron. Now, does everyone remember this story? He and his fellow outlaws beat the baron's entourage and then carved a boulder into the shape of Jánosik's fist as a warning to other despots. Another story told of Jánosik taking over the castle of a count and inviting the poor, hungry commoners from the town to eat the cruel count's feast. Now, my newspaper colleagues wouldn't have been inspired to storm castles or beat tyrants, at least not with our fists. But we were taught to use our words to give voice to the voiceless, much as Jánosik did when he told the baron that without peasants, the baron would have no fortune. We were instructed to look for the truth by telling the stories that others weren't telling, not just of the powerful, but the powerless, like the peasants at the feast. It sounds almost trite or quaint to recite an old journalistic axiom that a reporter's job is to, as we say, comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. You could understand that as comfort the troubled and cause trouble for the comfortable. Of course, the job is much more than that. But nonetheless, when we revisited our college paper, the other alumni and I said that we hadn't forgotten that old ideal and often found our best stories because of it, which isn't to say that we always got it right. More on that later. Talking about truth, particularly to those interested in journalism, seems pretty straightforward. Or it's pretentious, but I'll leave that to you. Journalists' calling, if they have one, ought to be telling the truth. Pretty uncontroversial. So now everybody venture forth, tell the truth, call out those who don't, and we can all go have a drink together. Sound good? Okay, except there's a problem. It's not always that simple. Talking about truth and journalism is far more complicated. I'm going to give you a political example from the United States. During the last US presidential campaign, news gatherers applauded themselves for fact-checking the campaigns. Who knew that such a thing would be worthy of attention? This seems a bit like congratulating a bus driver for stopping at red lights. The way many news organizations set up their coverage, this fact-checking was separate from the main part of the news writing operation. They had something called truth squads or fact checks. They were separate stories. They ran in boxes or in special graphics. And then there would be another story that was the main news story of the day. The candidate said this, and the other candidate said that. And then there'd be the separate box. I looked at it as if journalism students here at the university would be required to take one class in stenography to prepare you for writing down faithfully what the candidate said, and then another class in clever name-calling. And that class would prepare you to judge the value of the statements of the first story, as if those were separate jobs. Of course, the reporters who cover those big main news stories would take great umbrage at my characterization of their work, and they wouldn't be entirely wrong. Yet, there we were. The president said this, and Romney said this, and then the president said this, and Romney said this, and then the truth squatters. The Tampa Bay Times had something called a truth-o-meter. It sounds like something from a sci-fi children's show. The Washington Post, I still can't believe this, awarded virtual Pinocchio noses for untruths. Pinocchio noses. I guess that made for nice graphics because you put little pictures of Pinocchio's nose in the paper. There was factcheck.org and more than a few truth squads. PolitiFact, which is an online organization in part, graded candidate statements with what it called rulings. They included true, mostly true, half true, mostly false, and my personal favorite, pants on fire. Now, that last one comes from an old children's taunt. Liar, liar, pants on fire. Now, in English, that rhymes. I don't know how it does in Slovak, but I will tell you that most people outgrow it by the age of 6. And yet, there was an eminent news organization that would say to a candidate's remarks, pants on fire. You know, I also note, I sort of thought this was kind of funny, there wasn't a category for half false, and that I'm not sure what it takes to push a half truth into a mostly true category, but I think I'm just quibbling because I don't really know how these divisions come down one way or another. To give you an idea of the extent of this truth squatting, at one point I was giving a speech in a state other than mine. I was in Maine. And at the hotel, I was directed automatically to the Yahoo News homepage. And there was going to be a debate that night, a presidential debate. So, mind you, this debate had not yet happened. And there I was on the Yahoo News homepage, and this was the headline. Quote, "What Romney Obama won't get right tonight." Later, the page, when it refreshed, added, "Clearing the smoke before the debate." Well, I don't know what to do with that. If the debate hasn't happened, how much smoke can there be? And how do we know what they're going to get right? But these are labeled fact checks. So now we have news organizations fact-checking before the fact. It seems so quaint that we used to call these stories pre-writes or curtain raisers, because now we have people, I might as well call them crystal ball stories. We have people who are going to predict what they're going to say, and not only what they're going to say, but how right what they say is going to be. It went on. One of them went like this, quote, "Mitt Romney will likely home in on the president's handling of the Libya attacks, Obama's China jobs claims." By the way, if I were fact-checking that after the actual debate, I would have had to say pants on fire or give them Pinocchio noses, because that didn't happen. Okay, and I still can't get over pants on fire, so I'm sorry that I keep going back to that. I'm not suggesting that we need to be dry as tumbleweed in order to make ourselves interesting to readers, or that being funny or clever can make us more accessible. But I'm not sure that that's the way to go. I want to pause for a second to consider why these news organizations thought that these findings couldn't be part of the regular, top-of-the-fold politics coverage. Rather, imagine what it would be like if those noses and pants on fire were part and parcel of the mainstream coverage. Imagine if during the presidential debate, a moderator interjected with, "Thank you, Mr. President, but when you say the Republicans are going to dismantle Social Security for the elderly, I'm going to have to say pants on fire." I don't see that happening. Or, "Governor, the notion of the president using the phrase terrorist attack to describe the incident in Libya really is going to force me to call you Pinocchio." Okay, now can we imagine those phrases in the lead story of the New York Times? No. So for these and other reasons, all of the hold their feet to the fire truth charts and graphs were separate from the main news stories of the day, though some of those articles did indeed incorporate the language or the findings into the main body of the story. Still, it was separate staffers, separate departments, sometimes separate news organizations that were doing these fact checks. Why? Well, as much fun as I could poke at the notion that these truth squatters ply their trade outside of the main news stories, I can imagine some reasons why. Perhaps it's awkward to do a granular fact check within the body of a story. For starters, there can be a bias claim. Anytime a journalist draws a conclusion, he or she can be accused of favoring that point of view. It's actually one of the toughest things to explain to my University of California undergraduates. If a writer makes a determination about truth, that writer's making a judgment call. They ask me, isn't that bias or opinion writing? You tell us not to be human recorders, they say to me, writing down every he said, she said as if they were equally valid. But then you tell us to choose, and yet not editorialize or inject personal opinion. So I have to explain the very delicate balance that editorializing is different. It's not editorializing when the facts back up a conclusion. It's having indisputable facts that make a difference. Still, we live in a time when the facts themselves, to some people, are unprovable, belying the very definition of the word fact. It's a time when people with no expertise or research or knowledge will tell you that they know that the moon landing was faked and that vaccinations cause diseases. If you try to dispute these assertions with facts, with studies, with science, what you tend to hear is that's what they want you to think, where they is the US government, the EU, NASA, big pharmaceutical companies, organized crime. Any big group can be a they. Now, on the other hand, what happens if we put the fact check right in the story? What do you fact check? And what do you let stand, assuming that readers will see the statement for what it is and make their own determination? Let's say a candidate declares that the earth is flat. What is a responsible reporter to do? Do you let it, as people would have done in the past, stand on its own and assume that readers will take that for what it's worth? Because otherwise, can you imagine how that fact check would go if you put it in the story? Well, you interject with, actually, scientists since at least 1492 have almost uniformly agreed that the Earth is round, a fact later confirmed by satellite and other suprastellar photography. Well, now that's obviously silly, but to some writers, human-caused climate change is every bit as patently obvious. But if I were to ask for a show of hands in this room, could we come to an agreement on that issue? I don't know. So I don't know how we handle that. Now, I have to ask, what would you do? Which statements do you let stand? Which ones do you challenge in the body of a story? And how do you claim that it's not bias? I'll be honest with you. I have purposely led you astray to make a point. The truth is, I have no trouble asserting that it is the reporter's job to make determinations, even when it's hard, even in the face of opposition or claims of bias, even when the blogs and the vlogs and everyone else online is shouting, sciented. In one of his final columns as public editor of the New York Times, Arthur Brisbane asked if Times reporters should be, quote, truth vigilantes, calling out obvious distortions of fact. Readers who responded online were alternately incredulous, outraged, and appalled by the notion that journalists would be anything other than truth vigilante. One wrote, quote, should doctors be illness vigilantes, or is that going a little too far? Amid all of the hand-wringing about readers wanting only fluff, celebrity gossip, and worries that readers no longer cared about real journalism and didn't worry about sensationalism, here are some readers telling us exactly what they want. They want us to do our jobs. Another reader responded to the public editor's comments like this, quote, the real reason is, why would anyone trust a newspaper that allows people to lie to their customers? Why should anyone trust an outlet that knowingly allows politicians, corporations, etc., to spread propaganda? A newspaper that's not a truth vigilante is just a propaganda machine. As the readers of the Times noted, Brisbane's questions seem to be an indication of a fundamental misunderstanding of what traditional journalists have always done, looked for the truth. Old-fashioned reporting, enterprise reporting, investigative reporting, regular everyday reporting exists to elicit some kind of truth, not an opinion about the truth or a version of truth, but truth. So what does that mean? And what are journalists supposed to do? Well, to talk about truth, we'd have to ask some basic questions. What is truth? To whom are we telling it? What are the limitations of telling the truth? And how is it that some journalists feel compelled to lie? I will tell you that I don't necessarily have definitive answers for you, but I can tell you a little bit about how I approach the questions. To me, the short answer to what is truth is that it's sometimes different than we think. Journalists are often criticized for going into a story with what critics say is a preconceived notion of what they're going to find. I have to say that I don't really see that's the problem. If we don't have some clue what we're looking for, we can cast about aimlessly and wind up with a meandering series of facts, but not very much of a story, and even less truth. Rather, in my mind, the problem is when we aren't willing to let the facts take us in a different direction than we first anticipated. So if you forgive a rather silly example that makes me look even sillier, I'll tell you a story from when I was in graduate school in New York. I was bursting with enthusiasm and a clear sense of journalistic mission. I eagerly took on a class assignment about religion. Since I speak French, I was assigned to cover New York's Haitian community and decided, with all the purposefulness of a student out to right a wrong, that I would take on the issue of misguided white Americans who made a mockery of a legitimate animist religion, Voodoo, or what we commonly call voodoo. So I made an appointment with the top religious Voodoo leader in Brooklyn, called a Ungan, and I shared with him my mission. I wanted to write a story about the real Voodoo, I told him. Ignorant Americans see movies and think that Voodoo is about zombies and other nonsense, I said. I wanted to write a story about what it was really about. My memory of that call is that he seemed thrilled with what I was saying. I thought he was genuinely pleased that I was going to bother to learn the truth about his religion and dispel the myths and bring it to a larger American audience. So there I was, beaming with the wisdom of my fabulous story idea, heading to Brooklyn to the Ungan's shop. I waited for my audience with the Ungan amid rows of apothecary jars of dried roots and animal parts. It was straight out of Hollywood or Hogwarts. Finally, I was greeted by the Ungan. I again explained to him what I wanted to write, the real story of Voodoo, without all that Hollywood zombie nonsense. The Ungan, who spoke English and dressed in Western clothing, still seemed to be on the same page I was. He nodded and he smiled, and it was his turn to speak. I opened my notebook, I picked up my pen, poised to take down this real story. And then he told me, "The first thing you must understand, Abigail," he said, "zombies, they do exist." So much for my explode the myths piece. I'm not sure what story I ended up writing, but suffice it to say that it didn't lead with the notion that images from Hollywood horror movies weighed heavily upon this particular Haitian religious leader. To whom are we telling the truth? The answer is the readers, and sometimes they can be easy to forget. When a colleague and I first broached the notion of writing a multi-pronged story about the giant retailer Walmart, one editor told us he really didn't see the point. A lot of news outlets had already written a lot of stories about the company. It took getting a new business editor before we got anyone to buy into our central pitch. Our readers hadn't gotten much about the behemoth from Bentonville, Arkansas. And what's more, we tried to make the case that other publications hadn't really fitted the pieces together in the way we wanted to. Sure, there were lots of stories about a company that big, but we wanted to show the readers, not those other publications that might have gotten there first, how the pieces fit together. My main co-writer and I gave the series the working title, The Nation State of Walmart, because we aimed to show how Walmart's size and power and influence made it equivalent to its own country. As we spent nearly a year reporting and writing that story, dozens of big articles appeared in competing publications. There were documentaries, there were news shows, there were news segments, there were stories, there were series, there were magazine articles, and we cringed with every one. If they were good, we cringed more. Who would care about our story by the time it came out? The answer was the readers of the LA Times who hadn't gotten the information before or who hadn't seen it put together in quite that way. We never thought about awards, and I doubt that when the story was in progress, anyone would have thought we would get any. I think it wasn't until we saw the response from readers, hundreds of calls and letters and emails, that we realized we achieved our original mission, sharing a truth with our readers. In the extreme, truth, of course, can be dangerous. In those cases, we might think we know what to do. Our job is to tell the story, right? The dangers we face ought to be secondary. But what about when the dangers aren't to us? What will you do when the truth endangers a colleague or threatens a source? What will you do when the truth you wish to impart imperils someone you don't know? A few years ago, CNN's chief news executive, Eason Jordan, revealed a decade's worth of withheld information from his news-gathering operation in Iraq. He said that his team decided not to report about the torture of one of CNN's own Iraqi cameramen. Jordan said he also had declined to tell the world about the time Saddam Hussein's eldest son, Uday, told Eason Jordan himself that he planned to kill two of his brothers-in-law, as well as King Hussein of Jordan, who had given the pair asylum. Eason Jordan said he later warned the king. Nonetheless, Saddam Hussein's two sons-in-law, lured back to Iraq by Uday, were murdered. What could be more important as a journalist than publicizing the brutal workings of a government against whom at that time the US had fought one war and was contemplating another? Jordan had a response. The lives of his employees were more important. In the first case, he worried that Hussein would kill the cameraman, and perhaps the cameraman's family, and coworkers as well. When it came to Uday Hussein's threats, Jordan said he worried about the safety of his Iraqi translator. We could argue about whether or not Jordan's fears were justified, or if he made the right choice. If he had done a story, for example, about Uday's threats against his brothers-in-law, might those two men still be alive? Certainly, in similar situations, other reporters have decided that airing stories about torture or death threats would end the suffering and the danger. In a discussion about the movie Argo, about the rescue of 6 staffers of the US Embassy in Tehran, a longtime news producer of one of the big 3 US networks talked about the huge news scoop the network had and let go. Network reporters had confirmed that the US was on a brink of mounting a secret mission to try to free the remaining hostages. The mission involved special forces, helicopters, and a risky mission to refuel in the desert. The producers decided not to run the story. The analysis was simple, the producer said. Airing the story would have blown the cover of the mission, jeopardizing the lives of the hostages and effectively precluding any possibility of their rescue. Would the blogosphere of today make the same choice? Would the traditional media make that choice today, knowing that the online world would be chasing that same story? In the years before and after Jordan left CNN amid another controversy, many questioned whether he made the right choices, speaking about the incident. One media analyst, Alex Jones of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, said that good journalism always has, quote, tension between judgment and integrity, unquote. I'm not here to offer you an answer, but to ask you to think about what decision you would make. The question seems easy when we talk about the risks each of us would choose. But take a look at the people sitting next to you. Look on both sides. What do you do when the truth you want to report threatens them? When I was in college, as I mentioned, the 2 student papers, again, mine was the better one, fought bitterly for every story. And yet, at my paper, we often spouted another quaint old journalistic aphorism. I'd rather be right than be first. Even then, being able to say that, to give away a potential scoop, was a luxury. Years ago, many reporters who didn't work for the newswires, in traditional media, even under the pressure of daily deadlines, had some opportunity for thought or analysis, since the story was written over the course of some hours. Today, traditional reporters are charged with writing 2 stories at once, the story for tomorrow's paper or tonight's airwaves, which they hope will contain that level of thought and analysis. At the same time, many are required to write the instant story in real time for their organization's websites. In a media landscape where the balance between being first and being right might be quite different for us than it was years ago, what choice do reporters make? What if it isn't a life that's put in danger, but a livelihood? Is the decision to go to print or to air easier? I hope it's not too much more simple. I was in China to report a story about working conditions in the toy industry. Even those years ago, treatment of workers in China was a sensitive topic for the Chinese government. I had the aid of a native Chinese woman, an LA Times staffer who was employed as a researcher and translator. She was a trusted advisor to all the Times employees posted in China, and when I was there, she was just as invaluable to me. She urged extraordinary caution in how we operated. She encouraged me to change everything about how I normally did my job. I teach my students to announce themselves as reporters not more than a couple minutes after approaching a potential source on the street. The Times researcher told me that I had to be much more careful. The story we were chasing could be dangerous for her. Now, if we were arrested, the worst that would happen to me is that I'd be thrown out of the country, which would be a blow to the story, but also kind of cool. It'd be a badge of honor back at my office. I got thrown out of China. But to this researcher, it would be far different. For her, it could mean being interrogated by police over hours or days or longer about what kind of image of China she was showing an outsider. Our story might be even more dangerous for the very innocent people I was approaching, regardless of what they said to me. Just by speaking to these unsuspecting people, they could be in jeopardy. The walls have ears, she said. Anyone could be listening. So I followed her advice. We knew my phones at the hotel were tapped, so I spoke to my editors in a careful code. We tried to use obscure terms and teenage slang to flummox any listener. If you can believe it, we actually called the workers' rights advocates the members of the bowling league. I trust you. Believe me, I did not come up with that. That was my editor. And very reluctantly, I agreed to hold off on identifying myself as a reporter. I told her I wouldn't lie to anyone, but I agreed not to give the whole truth until she told me it was safe for the people I was speaking to. I told subjects that it was my first trip to China, which was true, and I was interested in learning about their lives and their jobs, also true. When the translator believed it was safe to do so, she would write down our real purpose and show it to them, or if the place were too public, she would call them later on the cell phones, and we got permission to use their comments that way. By the way, there's a great tool reporters didn't have 15 years ago. The people I was interviewing were peasants who did not have their own beds. They were often crowded 3 and 4 to a mattress in a room barely larger than the mattress itself, but all of them had cell phones. Quite a statement of the world. Then there's the flip side of telling the truth. Each of us knows better than to outright lie, and yet it happens again and again. Now, I'm guessing that the frequency and the numbers of fiction writers who pass themselves off as journalists have not increased. Certainly, the ethics of the good old days weren't necessarily so good or so ethical. Here's one of my favorite little asides. An LA Times reporter told me that years ago, many years ago, in order to get reporters from the LA Times and the other LA newspapers to cover a political event, the politicians had to offer alcohol at that news event so the reporters would come and hear what they had to say. Now, I cannot imagine, nor will I vouch for the quality or the coherence of those stories after they've plied the reporters with liquor, but nonetheless, that's how it used to be done. So I'm not necessarily all that nostalgic for the quote-unquote good old days. Certainly, it would have a different meaning in Slovakia. The good old days might also not be all so good. And yet, we have this idea that the fabricators are more. I think rather that the tools for finding them out are better. The ease with which we can discover lies are much more easily obtained by everybody. So the likelihood of being caught has changed, and yet it still happens. Many of us know the names and the stories. There was Stephen Glass from the New Republic, Jason Blair from the New York Times, Jonah Lehrer, who was found to have recycled material from several organizations. All of these were young, rising, exciting reporters. So if I were going to offer a flippant comment to about these incidents, I might suggest that being a young hotshot isn't all it's cracked up to be. But in these days of instant internet news and faster blogged response, I'm not sure most journalists would rather be right than be first. And yet, in our world of limitless sources of news and interpretation, when snappy writing might mean the difference between bursting onto the media scene or languishing in obscurity, perhaps we ought to consider a replacement adage, one that's no easier to make. I'd rather be dry than lie. Because in this new media world, we still only have one thing as our lingua franca, and that's our credibility. That is what sets apart journalists from average bloggers who opine from their dorm rooms, their apartments, or their parents' basement. Our credibility, it's our brand. Even in the online world, it has been and it will be what sets us apart. The longer lesson is probably to take great care about the little changes in stories that don't seem to matter. Just massaging a little detail or fixing a small part of a quote, little stretches aren't so far away from slightly larger leaps. Bigger liberties can become whole-scale falsehoods. The pressures, particularly of being young and anointed, seem to have the power to make liars out of people who dedicated themselves to telling the truth. In many of these cases, it seems that the quest for a flashy prose, the perfect quote, or the killer story-proving anecdote does them in. One of the things that strikes me most when I have looked for these perfect bits for my own stories is the realization that often it is just the opposite that is called for. Writing a story straight often gives more power to the idea that I'm trying to convey. Often a plain-spoken quote, rather than a flashy one, packs a bigger punch. And many times, that series of facts that seem to belie the central theme, the ones that would be so easy to omit, actually make a story stronger. It shows the work to be sophisticated and nuanced. Sometimes the objection or the interjection of a fact that would seem to contradict the rest of the piece is the very argument against a story that a reader would have. If a writer makes it first and then explains why that contradiction doesn't change the story, it is an opportunity to engage readers and even to persuade them. The good news about the hard job of telling the truth is that often it is easier than you might think. There are also some essential truths. On that trip to China, as the interpreter and I made our way through the dusty factory towns, I was struck by the notion that I was about as inconspicuous as a giraffe in a fish tank. People would get a look at me, and an entire village square would come to a halt. Has anybody ever seen an old US Western movie, John Wayne? Anybody know what I'm talking about? An old Western? John Wayne, can I see a show of hands? Anybody ever seen these? Okay, good, or at least a few of you have. All right, well, in every one of these, there's a scene that goes like this. It's the Old West in the United States, the lawless Old West. There are no streets, there's just dust and dirt and cowboys. And a stranger comes to town with his spurs jingling on his cowboy boots and his guns holstered on his hips. And he walks down the dusty road toward the saloon, where there's raucous music and loud voices and dancing girls. And there's always these half-high swinging doors into the saloon. So he walks past the half-high swinging doors and the loud crowd and in the saloon, and the second he walks past them, everything comes to a halt. The piano player stops playing, the voices are instantly silenced, and the only thing you hear is the squeak of the hinges on those swinging doors. That's about what it was like for 5'9" of me to walk through an industrializing factory town in rural China. It seemed as if the entire village would come to a halt. Everybody would stop talking, everybody would stare, everybody would look at me, and I somehow had to do a job. I remember at one point, actually, but I was sitting and interviewing someone while everybody stared, and a woman sat down next to me and started touching my hair, which was a little disconcerting for me. It was curly, and she would do this and pull it straight and see if it would curl back up, and pull it straight, see if it would, and I'm in the middle of an interview. And I looked at my translator and I said, what do I do about this? Like, this woman is, I don't know what's happening here. And she said, just ignore it, she'll go away. She did. Nonetheless, I had to do my best. I was there to interview poor migrant girls who traveled from China's impoverished rural interior in order to earn money to send back to their families. These are girls who had never been to a city before they got their jobs. The lucky ones had about a 10th grade education. Most had never seen an American or Western movie or television show. If they'd seen any American or non-Asian, it was on the factory floor as that person supervised or observed them. The young woman interviewed told me they'd never seen someone like me up close, and certainly not on the street. I had been warned that I would have a tough time doing interviews in China. Unlike the factory workers in Indonesia, where I had just been before going to Guangdong province, these were more reticent people, I was told. I had been told they were not accustomed to speaking to journalists or speaking to any strangers. Of course, the Chinese don't exactly encourage a free expression of ideas. And yet that wasn't what I found when I got there. Several of the women I met in Guangdong invited me back to their tiny apartments, small, concrete floor, one-room dwellings shared by several women. We communicated through the Times interpreter, but there were parts of the interviews for which no interpretation was needed. The towns where they lived were virtually cities of women. Women make up the bulk of migrant labor pool in China, as men continue to work on the family plots generously called farms. And sometimes, women talking are just women talking. To me, the essential truth wasn't so much in what they said. It was their desire to be heard. It was in their eagerness to talk and to listen to another woman who might as well have come from a different planet. They wanted me to hear about their lives. They wanted Americans to hear about what they went through to make the toys that our children take for granted. That's what they told me. They thought hour after hour after hour of work about the faraway children who would one day play with the toys they built 12 or 18 or 20 hours a day. They couldn't imagine what those children's lives were like, they said. But they probably correctly assumed that anyone lucky enough to own one of the toys they had made had lives easier than theirs. They thought about those children, worker after worker told me. More than one woman asked me if those children, or the people who buy toys from them, ever think about the workers who made them. I didn't have an answer. All I could do was relay the question. But at that moment, and at many moments since then, their poignant question felt like an awesome responsibility. The truth there was in the question. I'd like to close by returning to some reader comments on the New York Times website, this time in response to a column by yet another public editor, Margaret Sullivan, titled, "He Said, She Said, and the Truth." In it, Sullivan writes about what she calls false balance or false equivalency. She defines that as the journalistic practice of giving equal weight to both sides of a story, regardless of an established truth on one side. Sullivan writes that, quote, "readers are fed up with it." She offered the example of voter fraud. In the United States, some readers took issue with a front-page story that attempted what we call balance by offering both sides of a voter fraud story. It went like this. On the one hand, some public officials say the only way to ensure the integrity of the voting process is to tighten voter identification requirements. On the other hand, advocates for elderly, poor, and legal immigrant voters note that these new restrictions could have a chilling effect on those people's ability to vote. By the way, each of those groups also are more likely to vote for the Democratic Party. The problem, those readers wrote, is that the Times itself had investigated voter fraud and found little evidence of abuse. The Times ran into a similar problem with climate change. They do massive investigations, only 2 days later to have another reporter say, on the one hand, many scientists believe that humans cause climate change. On the other hand, many critics do not. If your own paper has made a determination, can't we say it? Sullivan noted that they had a similar debate about the theory of evolution. They now add a qualifier when they talk to people who don't believe in the theory of evolution to say, there is no credible scientific challenge to the theory of evolution. Still, the reporter who wrote the voter identification story and his editor said they had reservations about coming down on one side or another, saying the issue is contentious. Here's what Sullivan decided. Quote, "It ought to go without saying," Sullivan wrote, "but I'm just going to say it anyway. Journalists need to make every effort to get beyond the spin and help readers know what to believe, to help them make their way through complicated and contentious subjects." Commentators on the website, once again, were exasperated. Not many readers were worried about bias. They were worried about being able to trust their newspaper. One wrote, "When did, quote, all the news that's fit to print become, quote, all the nonsense that anyone wants to tell us?" When we think about readers and what they want from us in this brave new online world, one in which it seems that every fourth blog purports to be news or journalism, I'd like to ask that we think of one of the less bombastic comments the Times got in response to that column. A poster who signed in as William Hicks of Missouri wrote, quote, "I'd be ecstatic just to hear a journalist ask a decent series of follow-up questions once in a while, something that never happens anymore. They just smile at the lies told and move on to their next insipid questions." Unquote. It seems a fair enough request, and the least a reporter can do, if indeed our mission is to seek the truth. Ještě raz vám děkuji. Bolormistio se vás priovarit. How'd I do? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the thoughtful lecture or talk, and I hope that it did inspire some questions in the audience. You also, if you feel you are more comfortable to write down your questions, I believe you have some papers. You can write it down either in Slovak or in English, and we will translate the questions. Kľudne napíšte otázky aj v slovenčine, ak sa cítite istejší, a my potom preložíme tie otázky. So please, the floor is yours. I think it doesn't work.
Can you hear me? Am I on here? So I just want to say, there is almost nothing that I haven't been asked. So there is nothing any of you is going to ask me that will surprise me. Go ahead. I talk to students all the time, and there's a reason I do it. I like it.
Ja som Viktor Wurm, budem sa pýtať radšej po slovensky. Volá sa to Na pravde záleží a v dnešnej dobe sa ľudia potýkajú s rôznymi takými prekážkami pri hľadaní pravdy. A medzi takých žurnalistov by sa teoreticky dalo zaradiť aj Edwarda Snowdena alebo Juliana Assangea. Mňa by zaujímali dve otázky alebo odpovede. Či sú to podľa Abigail hľadači pravdy alebo skôr blázni? Či je to porušenie nálepky top secret v rámci hraníc, ktoré spomínala, hľadania pravdy? A ako sa na týchto nepriateľov štátu pozerajú Američania? Ďakujem.
So the question is that, like when you seek truth, there are many obstacles, and the gentleman is asking that, of course, that Julian Assange and Snowden might be also included in the group of truth seekers. And his question is how the United States or you personally look at their efforts to find truth, or whether you would rank them among truth seekers.
I think it's an excellent question. And there would have been a time in the United States when these men would have been hailed as heroes. If you look at the history in the United States, it hasn't been that long since the Pentagon Papers were published. And there may have been claims of treason and problems, but there were also claims that this was heroic and a part of democracy. And yet, that isn't the case here. So, are they journalists? I don't know if they're journalists, but they're certainly sources, and they're certainly brave to do what they did. I think we need journalists to wade through those findings and make some determinations, because it's unclear what some of them are. When you have something like WikiLeaks, it is a dumping ground for information. Somebody needs to sort through and examine that information. But these are the sorts of invaluable sources of information that are critical to a democracy. And I think both of those gentlemen had a good idea of what they were getting into. There are other examples. And in most of those cases, you look at the risks people took, and they would tell you they knew what they were and decided that it was worth it and it was important.
Next question. Ďalšie otázky. Okay, so while we are waiting, there is one more.
Raz, dva, tri. Dobrý deň, volám sa Anton Gbur. Mňa by zaujímalo, či ste si po získaní Pulitzerovej ceny povedali, super, dosiahla som všetko, idem na dôchodok, alebo ešte stále máte takú potrebu niečo v živote dosiahnuť a čo? A či aj vy ste niekedy boli na takom rozpoložení, či sa rozhodnúť skôr pre tú pravdu, alebo pre tú rýchlosť pri uverejnení článku?
In answer to the first part about the Pulitzer, I think it's important to note that I don't think I ever wanted a Pulitzer. To me, it wasn't something that I mean, I'm sure I thought it would be nice, but it wasn't something that I ever thought would or could happen. So it wasn't like a fulfillment of a long-time dream. It was more of a shock. And no, I did not feel like it was time to retire. I remember the weekend after the Pulitzer ceremonies, I was back in LA and I was working the Sunday afternoon shift, which is a really awful shift at the paper. There's no news, you're stuck there, you're bored. Anyway, I walk into the paper and I go in and I sit in the Sunday news meeting, and there were a couple senior editors there and their jaws dropped and they said, "Weren't you just in New York getting the Pulitzer and here you are?" And all I could say was, yes, newspapers are wonderfully democratizing places. They know just how to humble you right again. I think when you become a journalist, it's because you love being a journalist. And then your process is never done. Never. There are always things I want to write. I meet someone on an airplane and I want to write about it. I meet someone, I walk down the street, I see something interesting, I want to write about it. I ask questions like somebody's 4-year-old. Why? 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 How? What? Why? It drives everybody crazy, but it means I probably picked the right profession. And it also means that I'll never be done. The goal is not prizes. It never was, nor would it be now. The goal is to do stories that I'm proud of, to do stories that in my mind bring to light something different, that give voice to somebody who otherwise wouldn't have one, or that could look at an issue in a different way. As far as being right and being fast, when did I have? Oh, I have those decisions all the time. It's a regular part of being a daily journalist. There are often facts I had to leave out because I didn't have them confirmed. It is crucial to me. I would always rather be right than be first. It is a terrible feeling the next day when you've gotten something wrong. Now, I will say, if you've been a journalist for long enough and you haven't had a correction, you're doing something wrong. It means you're not pushing yourself or you're not truthful about when you've had something incorrect. But it still is a terrible feeling, and you feel like nobody's ever going to trust me again. That feeling stays with you, and it should, when you're reporting the next story. Hopefully, it doesn't make you too timid to do your job, but it makes you check and recheck and recheck and take something out if you don't have it verified.
Nejaká ďalšia otázka?
Môžem ešte jednu? Aha. Mňa by ešte zaujímalo, či ste sa pre Slovensko rozhodli podobne ako pre Čínu, že sme pre vás nejaká exotická krajina.
Well, I have not been to Slovakia before, so in that sense, it's different for me. But exotic? No, it's beautiful, and I'm so glad to be here. But I was telling my hosts that I may live in LA, but actually I come from Chicago, which has a huge Slovak population, Slavic population, and what's interesting to me is that more than almost any country I visited, the people I see here look like home to me because of the population of where I'm from. Another funny thing was that I didn't know that so many people had connections to Slovakia when I was planning this trip, but as I told people where I was going and what I was doing, every third person I talked to had family from Slovakia, their mother was from Slovakia, someone at school, actually, she grew up in Bratislava, and she was so excited I was going because then my son was going to talk to her son about Slovakia, and it was very interesting to me because it was something that I hadn't anticipated. And in LA also, talked to a couple people who'd been here for film shoots and loved it and couldn't say enough about it. So I was very excited, and the rest of my family's very jealous. And I don't think I stick out quite as much. I'm not quite the giraffe in a fish tank here. At least I hope not.
Môžete sa pýtať akékoľvek otázky. Radšej odovzdáte, áno? Dobre, ups.
how you are picking your topics or selecting your topics. And the second question, why did you decide to go to China?
As far as picking my subjects, there's always a balance when you work for a newspaper in particular. You see, you're going to get assignments from your editor, and Beata, you'll forgive me. Most of the assignments from your editor are not the stories you want to do. So the job every day is to come up with a story that your editor will like enough not to give you the story that day about the weather or about the parade of dogs or about the third grade class that's making a chain for peace or about the man on the corner, whatever they're going to come up with. So that's always the balance. So how do you pick the stories? For me, the big stories come from little stories. I like being what's called a beat reporter, covering a specific subject, because the small stories you cover on that subject are what, to me, lead to the bigger, broader stories. I think it's why our Walmart story was different. I was the retail reporter. My co-writer was the labor reporter. Often at big newspapers, they have these big projects, investigative teams that do big, serious projects. I don't have a lot of time for those teams. I think they make a mistake by looking at big issues from the top down. When you're a reporter who covers a subject intensely, those big topics bubble up from the bottom. The reason we started on the Walmart story was because more and more of the things I was hearing in the retail world seemed to have something to do with Walmart. Walmart didn't really exist in California, but every company was citing Walmart as a reason they were doing X or Y. The same thing on the labor beat, and that was how we approached the story. So how do I come up with stories? It starts with what interests me. That's a good way to start. What do I think is interesting? And I start there. What do I question? One of the more important characteristics of a good reporter is being curious. And what you are curious about will often lead you in the direction of a good story. Sorry, the second part of the question.
Why did you decide to go to China?
The China story, I had been covering the toy industry, and I wanted to write a different kind of story about manufacturing toys. I think there had been lots of stories about abuses of workers, and I certainly believed at the time that that existed, and of course I was right. But that wasn't really the story I wanted to do. I wanted to do a story about the biggest toy maker in the world, which is Mattel. If they make Barbie dolls and Hot Wheels cars. Are these familiar to people? Okay. That's Mattel. It's based in LA. It's the biggest toy maker. But when you're a big toy maker, what you actually are is a big toy importer at this point. I wanted to do a story about Mattel's attempts to be an ethical manufacturer. So I said to my editor, and by the way, this is a way to never pitch a story. This was the worst pitch ever. I said, I want to do this story, but just so you know, it's not going to make any headlines, it's not going to make any news, it's not going to be sensational, and it's not going to have any child workers, any armless workers, nobody's going to be abused. That's not the story I'm going to write. So if you want that story, don't send me. Again, not a good way to pitch a story. Beata, you liking that story so far? You think, why am I doing this? Instead, I said I wanted to write a very nuanced story. What happens? Is it possible for a company to produce things in an ethical way? The short answer is maybe not so much. But Mattel was making a better attempt than almost any other company, and I wanted to see what would happen, and that's why I went. So I was in China, I was in Indonesia, I was in Mexico, Hong Kong, and France, of all places, looking at some of their operations and talking to people.
Ešte nejaká otázka?
Na Slovensku sme mali kedysi cenzúru v médiách kvôli režimu a chcela by som sa opýtať, či aj vy ste sa stretli s cenzúrou, keď ste chceli nejaký článok vypustiť a nemohli ste.
It's different. I'm sure you know that in the United States we have freedom of the press, but there are other dangers, and they're insidious. And I imagine that they're ones that reporters increasingly face in Slovakia. When the government can't stop a report, they do other things. They cut off access. They threaten you. If your job is to cover the Pentagon, and they say, if you write this story, we're going to revoke your credentials, meaning you will not be able to cover the Pentagon. You won't be allowed in the building. That's a threat. You have to have a news organization that will stand behind you and give you a new beat and help you out. There are all kinds of subtle pressures that people can place on you. There are lots of reporters who've been cut out for a time by companies, by government, by somebody, as a way to try to intimidate them into not writing a story. And of course, there are lawsuits that people file. In some of those lawsuits, they're particularly insidious because nobody questions the veracity of the report. They get the reporter on other grounds because they can't question the veracity of the report. There are some famous cases like that in the US. It's something that reporters know and keep in mind, and today, when we learn of the level of government surveillance in the US, it is particularly chilling to reporters. Average Americans say, if you're not doing anything wrong, what do you care if the government is listening to you make plans with take your grandmother on a picnic? And the answer is, if you're a reporter, that's not all you're doing. So reporters are going to have to fundamentally change the way they operate to protect their sources, because now we know that there is almost nothing sacred, nothing safe, and maybe worst of all, the news organizations might not even know that the government has their information, their phone logs, their emails, because they'll get it off of a server somewhere in Europe. So all of these things are pressures that we face. Is the government going to pull a story? It's very, very, very hard. But they found plenty of other ways to try to intimidate reporters. They're not going to, they will occasionally threaten to subpoena your sources, and you could get thrown in jail, but it's not quite the same way as in the former East Bloc, where merely writing it or saying it could get you in trouble. It's more subtle, and sometimes that's hard because you don't know where it's going to come from. What is this pressure going to look like?
Takže máme čas pre posledné 3 otázky. Čiže vy...
Thank you for an excellent lecture. I would like to ask if there is a specific story which you read and therefore decide to become a journalist.
I wish I could point to one. I can't. I used to read the paper every day. And in Chicago, when I was growing up, there were 2 main newspapers. And I was the only person I know. Both of them were morning newspapers. In the US, there used to be morning newspapers and afternoon papers. I don't know if you had that here. Once the nightly news essentially killed the afternoon papers, but there still were some. Both the papers in Chicago were morning papers, but I didn't know that for a long time because we got one paper delivered to our house, and then my father took the train to work, and he in the afternoon would get the other paper and bring it home, read it on the train coming home, and bring it home at night. So I thought that was an afternoon paper for the longest time. People laugh in Chicago when I say, yeah, but I used to think that was an afternoon paper. So there were 2 papers in my house every day, and I loved them. I actually, all through school, thought I was going to do something else, and one day woke up and said, no, I want to be a reporter. And I remember my mother, she'd never heard me say anything about this. I studied classical voice. I was a singer, and it's what I thought I was going to do. And all of a sudden, I woke up and said, I'm going to be a journalist. And my mother, who didn't know anything about journalism, said, but you don't even know the inverted pyramid. And she was right, I didn't. And I said, well, I guess I'll have to learn, because that's what I want to do. By the way, the inverted pyramid, not so much anymore. But, I think I liked the idea of storytelling. I like talking to people. I like hearing people's stories. I like meeting people. And for me, I'm outgoing. I'm not shy. I've not had a shy day in my entire life. And so I have no problem going up and talking to people. But it gives me a mandate to do so. I have met, and certainly I've had students who are shy, and they like journalism because it forces them to talk to people in a way that they would not otherwise. So there wasn't one story, but more it was a series of things. I like to write, but I like to listen, and I like to talk to people. And that combination made this an irresistible profession.
We have some written questions. Recently, a lecturer told us that he knows a lot of good journalists who switched to yellow press or the yellow press because they simply needed to get money to keep their family wealthy or to survive. So how to face this question? Rather to live a wealthier life with enough means and write about what people really want to read, or to search and follow the truth, but then to live in a less wealthy life?
Well, that's a tough one, and I understand the difficulties of making those decisions. I usually tell people that if you think you might want to be a journalist, or you might want to be a circus clown, or a lawyer, or you could, okay, all jokes about those being the same thing notwithstanding. You think you might want to be a journalist or you might want to be something else, I always say do the something else. Don't be a journalist. This is a job for people who cannot imagine doing anything else. And if that's the case, it's a great profession. And I will say that more today than at any other time, there are ways to make a living and still do work you can be proud of. It doesn't mean doing some work you're proud of and some you're ashamed of. But instead, there are more outlets than ever. And what I've seen people do is cobble together work that interests them and work that's less interesting, but with no less integrity. So they'll work for a trade publication to make money, and then they'll do an investigative piece that makes them a lot less money but gives them a lot more satisfaction. Once you've crossed over into what the questioner calls yellow journalism, then your credibility is gone and you can't do those more meaningful pieces. There are other ways. My students, some of them are entrepreneurs. They have ideas for websites or ways that they are going to make their own living, not be tied to a newspaper, not be tied to a radio station. They're going to do their own thing. Those opportunities abound. You are all the ones who are going to teach us what those opportunities are. You have opportunities by being here, by being in this place at this time to do amazing work, journalistically and entrepreneurially. The world is for you to shape how you want. The only two choices are not good journalism and bad journalism. There was a time when that might have been the case. It's not anymore.
Do you find sometimes your work frustrating? And the reason why, if you, during your work, you find something which you cannot change, how do you fight this feeling of helplessness?
It's frustrating for so many reasons, on so many levels, on so many days. It's when you come across an intractable problem, the only thing I believe, and it probably betrays me to be very much an American, is that sunshine is the antidote to darkness. Shining light on an issue is one of the few bits of recourse we have. I am not going to change homelessness in America. I don't think I have the power with anything I could write to do that. But might I have the power to make one person's life better? Maybe. Might I have the power to make one small change that would make it a little easier for some group of people? Maybe. And at the end of the day, that's enough. I gave up changing the world because I don't know that I can do that, but I'm very, very happy to work on a little piece of a little problem or a little piece of a big problem every day. That's a lot more satisfaction than people get by being accountants or photocopier salesmen. I do not cast any aspersions on anybody who does an honest day's work. But for me, if I'm just changing a little bit of a little problem for one person, I feel pretty good that day. So I try not to go too far into despair and say, but I've only done one little thing. Well, that's one little thing I did that I didn't do yesterday.
Ja by som mal dve otázky. Prvá otázka. Ako sa dá rok robiť na jednej téme? Spomenuli ste, že či vám to v práci umožnili, alebo vy ste boli tak zažratá do tej témy? Ako je to prakticky v dnešnom mediálnom, hektickom zhone možné? A druhá otázka, či za ten Walmart efekt alebo pri iných témach ste čelili nejakým žiadostiam o opravu, nejakým zákulisným tlakom alebo dokonca súdnym žalobám? A ako dopadli? Či ste museli platiť, či musel vydavateľ platiť a koľko?
As far as the first part goes, how did I get to spend? I got to do it more than once. Spend almost a year on a story. And it's because I am the luckiest person I know. There are very few news organizations that would allow journalists to do that. I happen to work for one that did. And I will tell you, this goes back to, there were always these special teams of special reporters doing special assignments. I was not so special. I was not special at all, nor was my co-writer. Instead, we came up with a good idea, and we had a new editor who was dumb enough to let us do it and not give it to some of the special reporters. So it was luck. And I happened to work for a very big newspaper that could afford to take people out of the rotation. And to be honest, I like the mix of stories. If I just wanted to do long project stories, I would have been a magazine writer, and probably what I will do in the future. But at that time, I really liked doing some stories every day, one story a week then spending a month on a story, and then spending 6 or 8 months on a story. It was an incredible luxury that very, very few reporters in the US ever got. The LA Times was known for it. A lot of people called it, as a way to denigrate it, a daily magazine. And it was a way they made fun of it, but I thought that was a great thing. As far as, is it pressure to change the story? Asking for changes, one of the cardinal rules is that no one outside the paper sees the story before publication. It's absolute. Now, that doesn't mean they don't ask. They do. People who know better ask, but it is an absolute rule. You will not see this story before it goes to print. That might cause some people not to cooperate, but that's how it goes. Walmart is not a benevolent company that was looking to do me a favor. They had a reason to cooperate with us, and it's because they were looking to expand in California. And even after the story appeared, and even after it got a lot of attention, it was funny, Walmart's only complaint wasn't with us, it was with a quote in the story. Somebody quoted, had said something incorrect, and they wrote a letter about that. I thought, okay, fine. And they still returned my phone calls. But they could not ask for changes because they could not have ever seen the story before it ran. As far as afterward, they had no lawsuit against us because in order to file suit, they would have to prove not just that we wrote something incorrect, but the way the law works, they would have to prove that we had a reckless disregard for the truth and had done so on purpose, had lied, and it still would be almost insurmountable. So first of all, there were no factual errors, and second of all, even if we'd had a factual error, they couldn't prove that we were out to get them, and that's pretty much the standard.
Takže ešte tam bola posledná otázka, ale neviem, či ešte stále. Takže posledná.
I was told you guys might be shy. You're not shy at all.
Ja mám otázku, že v dnešných médiách sa do popredia stále dostáva násilie a negatívne správy a to pôsobí aj na tú psychiku čitateľov. Nemyslíte si, že je nedostatok pozitívnych správ?
I will tell you, compared to you, I might seem old. I'm not that old, but that criticism has been around, I think, forever. All I see is negative. There's an old expression on TV news in the US, if it bleeds, it leads, which again rhymes in English. And what that means is if it's bloody and gory and horrible, that's the first thing on the nightly news. There has always been negative news. I personally, I don't think, it's not my job to paint a happy picture of the world. It's my job to report on the state of the world. I don't think it's that the news is negative. I think there are a lot of negative things that happen in our world. Now, I would say any publication does a disservice by not also inspiring readers with other kinds of news, because there are also amazing things that happen every day in science, in education, in small victories. Those are wonderful stories too. But it's a newspaper's job to both reflect the world and then also to entertain and to be good storytellers. All of those pieces have a role in a newspaper, and they're all valid to me. But I do not worry that we go out of our way just to show the negative. I think there are negative things and that it's our job to report on them. But we would be remiss if we didn't also point out wonderful things.
I would like to thank Abigail Goldman for spending the time with us and sharing her thoughts. And I hope that you will take away something which will make you think further. So thank you very much for your attention and your time.
Thank you so much. It has been my pleasure.